We're here with you, gently and honestly, and we want you to feel it. You are loved, you are cared for, and your rest matters to us more than anything tonight. Set down what you're carrying, even if it's only for a little while. We'll hold it for you. Your breath is enough, your pulse is a soft drum, and you don't have to impress a soul. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? We're listening, truly. Now grab your coffee, warm between your hands, smell the quiet sweetness rising with the steam, and let's begin. We'll go slow. We'll go kindly. I remember the boy the way a tide remembers the moon, always and without hurry. He was small, in the years that mattered most, and the house around him didn't so much stand as it hummed like a held note in a distant lullaby. Nights had a way of leaning in around his windows, pressing cool starlight against the glass, painting slow clouds that moved like thoughts you only half admit to. He'd lie awake and feel the sky say his name in a voice that belonged to no one and everyone, a soft whisper that refused to be urgent. That whisper was not a call to adventure. It was a kind of permission to be gentle, to be pliant, to stretch. When life pushed, to bend without breaking. The kitchen knew him better than the mirror. It knew his first reach for light, the way he'd stand on his toes and click the switch, and the room would glow butter yellow, patient as morning. His mother's hands would move through the warm square of illumination, assembling sandwiches that were always a little lopsided, wrapped in napkins like secret letters. Sometimes she sang nothing in particular, a tune that sounded like the comfort of someone staying. He didn't always understand her words. Grown-up phrases dropped like small pebbles into a stream, but he always understood the way she exhaled when she saw him. A door opening, a quiet promise that love, however imperfect, would show up again. There was a grandfather, too, with thunder in his pockets and a flashlight mind that could split a night into pieces. The boy admired him the way a sunflower admires daylight, hopeful, a little confused, and with a neck that sometimes hurt from looking up. The old man's eyes ran ahead of his body. His ideas did the same. Rooms felt different after he left them, as if the air kept practicing what he had tried to teach it. Tiny experiments of brightness that made your heart both curious and tired. The boy learned something important from that. Brilliance can be loud and kindness can be quiet, and both are true, and both can ache in their own ways. The first time the boy realized he had a kind of power, it wasn't fireworks, it was the opposite. The dog down the street barked all afternoon, a heartbreak of sound that frayed the neighborhood in invisible threads. He went to the fence, pressed his palm to the peeling paint, and waited. The waiting was the power. He softened his breathing. He let the bark be a bark without making it mean something else. 2 minutes passed, then 5, then the evening remembered its manners and turned the light down. The dog wore out its sorrow and sat. The boy felt, not triumphant, but taller on the inside, as if he'd learned a new way to share a room with pain. Everyone had their small chores. His sister kept a list and crossed things out with the zeal of a cartographer naming rivers. She was wind and spine, laughter that arrived with elbows. The boy saw how she guarded the family with loudness, because quiet was where her worries lived. He recognized it because he did the opposite. He guarded them with silence, with space, with a presence that said, "Go on, say what you need to say, take all the time, I'm here and I won't snap." They didn't articulate this truce. They didn't have to. It was a hinge the house swung on. The sky kept returning to him like a line he could always rehear. On a late summer night, He took a stool to the open window and leaned into the dark. The neighborhood's lights blinked like thoughtful insects. Somewhere, a radio played a song so old it felt new. He let his thoughts loosen their shoes. He watched a single cloud take forever to cross a single piece of sky. The world, he realized, wasn't asking him to hurry. If he listened closely, it was asking him to linger. He tucked that away, a small, folded note he'd carry for years. There is a kind of courage in patience, and it's the kind that doesn't look like courage at all. When mornings came, they came with the gentle bustle of a life trying its best. Cereal rattled against bowls. The refrigerator offered a light that was pure mercy. His mother would check the calendar and pretend it made sense. His grandfather would appear with something that clicked or hummed or winked, call it a little project, and wave away questions, with a grin that did not entirely hide the weight he carried. The boy learned to stand near without needing to fix, to be a quiet shoreline where the water could rest after all that motion. This, he understood later, was the center of his strange gift. He could stretch time around a moment until it fit the people inside it. At school, he moved through hallways that smelled of pencil shavings and gym floor polish, where friendships were small boats you hoped would not tip. He never fought for space. He made space. When someone was left out, he drifted a little closer until out felt less like a cliff and more like a curb you could step up from. He didn't talk about it. He didn't need a medal. He just believed in the simple physics of gentleness. Add warmth and things expand to hold you. He wondered if the universe worked like that too. Maybe stars were just the result of someone somewhere deciding to stay. There were evenings when his grandfather took him out under the sparse backyard, trees, and pointed at constellations, naming them less like facts and more like neighbors. The old man would begin a sentence as if it were a rocket, and then set it down like a feather, surprising himself. Sometimes he forgot what he was about to prove. Sometimes he remembered at once and laughed at the elegance of it. The boy came to love these almost answers. They taught him the pleasure of being close to understanding without needing to own it. The sky, after all, had always been most generous in its maybes. On the worst days, the house sounded like a drawer jammed wrong. Voices caught on each other. Meals went cold at the corners. He felt everything at once and then felt guilty for feeling everything, as if the tenderness he carried were an inconvenience. He tried to become small. It didn't help. So he tried something else. He breathed. He watched the kitchen light turn the silverware into small moons. He made a sandwich very slowly. Bread, soft, then the spread, smoother than you'd think. Then the second slice, aligned, not perfect, but honest. He cut it into two halves that could meet again. He set one on a napkin by the sink for anyone who might need it. That was enough to coax the room back into being a room. Sometimes, late, his sister would knock on the frame of his open door, not quite inside, not quite out. She never said what the day had done to her. He never asked. He just shifted a little, to make space, and she sat on the edge of the bed like a moon on the edge of a pond. They'd talk about nothing and everything, the way the sky had looked at 5, the way the dog down the street had finally learned to nap. Before she left, she'd ruffle his hair and tell him not to tell anyone she could be soft. He promised the way you promised to the night, sincerely, knowing tomorrow you'll have to promise again. The boy gathered years as if they were feathers, light but real. He didn't grow into someone else, he grew into more of himself. When teachers asked him what he wanted to be, he said "Here!" And they'd laugh, thinking he was clever. He wasn't trying to be clever. He meant it. The now was where people kept their hands, their breaths, their unspoken apologies. He wanted to meet them there where everything mattered just enough. And always the whisper. Not louder, not clearer, just present. It said his name as if the syllables had been waiting for their turn to be kind. It suggested he could be the kind of person who didn't fix the world, but who let the world catch its breath in his presence. He practiced that in ways no one would notice. He walked slower to match an old neighbor's pace. He let the kettle sing for a beat longer so his mother could finish her thought. He listened to the silence after a joke, honoring the way laughter fades like a tide that always promises to return. At the end of one quiet day, with the backyard half asleep and the first evening star rubbing its eyes, he went out and stood where the grass gave slightly under his feet. The air smelled like someone somewhere had just opened a book. He closed his eyes. The boy didn't ask for a sign. He didn't need permission. He simply let himself be the size he was, no bigger, no smaller, a person-shaped kindness under a patient sky. The night was not in a hurry. Neither was he. The moment unspooled, long and tender, and he found he could hold it, not as an owner, but as a careful friend. The kitchen light clicked off. The house sighed. A cloud took its time, and I, still here with him, felt the soft hinge of the world as it swung from day toward night, from noise toward hush, from trying toward being. Somewhere, a lullaby remembered its melody. Somewhere, a sandwich waited on its napkin for whoever needed a simple grace. And the boy, who was already a quiet kind of hero, breathed in and out, and the sky, for reasons that didn't need explaining, whispered back. The whisper from the sky lingered, not as a command, but as a companion, like the faint hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen when everything else had gone still. The boy carried it into the next mornings, tucked into his chest when no one could see. It gave him a way of walking that felt less like moving forward and more like flowing through a current that already knew the way. Each step was ordinary, and yet there was an undertone of something patient and waiting, as if the air itself believed in him long before he could believe in himself. Breakfasts were quiet rehearsals of love in disguise. His mother, often distracted by the half-finished puzzles of her own heart, still placed a plate in front of him with small care. The toast was sometimes burned at the edges, the jam uneven, yet to him it always felt like a gift left on an altar no one had taught him to worship. He noticed the lines on her forehead deepening, noticed how her sighs sometimes lingered in the room longer than her voice, and he wondered if love was often shaped more by exhaustion than triumph. Still, he held those moments carefully, because he understood even then that imperfect love was still love, and sometimes the most honest kind. His sister, quick and restless, was louder in the mornings. She banged drawers, made the spoons clatter, pushed her way through the ordinary like a storm, unwilling to wait for anyone's permission. He admired that about her, her ability to move without apology. When she teased him, he rarely answered back, and she mistook it for weakness. But it wasn't weakness, it was his quiet power, the way he made room for her fire without needing to extinguish it. He knew that her laughter, even when sharp, was a shield against a loneliness she couldn't yet name. By not fighting her, he was standing with her, though she would only realize it much later. Rick, the grandfather who carried both brilliance and ruin in his bones, drifted in and out of these mornings like weather. Some days he was gone before dawn, leaving a scatter of notes on the table filled with equations the boy could not understand, words scribbled sideways in haste, stains of coffee and chemicals. Other days he lingered too long, speaking in bursts of wild energy that made the house feel both alive and unstable. The boy would watch him with an awe that wrestled quietly with unease. Here was a man who could unlock the secrets of galaxies, yet could not always unlock the door to his own heart. That paradox sat in the boy's chest like a knot. He loved him, feared him, and wanted desperately to be seen by him all at once. It was in those spaces between presence and absence that the boy began to notice the strangeness of his own gift. He didn't call it a gift then. He just knew that people, even the restless, even the broken, seemed to breathe differently when he was near. Arguments slowed, rooms softened. Sometimes it was so subtle that no one else noticed, but he did. He could feel tension shift the way a sailor feels the wind turn. He practiced it quietly, as if it were a secret exercise, listening not to words, but to pauses, finding the rhythm beneath anger, waiting for the silence that always came after noise. He learned to trust that silence, to cradle it, until others trusted it too. One late afternoon, when the sun leaned low and golden against the windows, he found himself in the backyard again. The grass was cool under his palms, the air thick with the scent of soil that had recently been watered. He lay there, watching the sky unroll its slow fabric, and thought of how everything stretched: time, shadows, even love. Stretching, he realized, wasn't breaking. It was how the world made space for itself. And he wondered if maybe his whole life would be about that, making space without demanding anything in return. His sister called out to him from the porch, impatience in her voice, but also something softer she didn't let out often. She wanted him to come inside, to sit with her in the half-light before dinner. She didn't say why, she didn't need to. He followed, and as they sat side by side without words, he felt the bond between them weaving tighter. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. It was in the way her shoulder leaned just enough to brush against his, in the way she let the silence exist between them without trying to fill it. In that silence, he knew she trusted him. Later, as the house dimmed and Rick's footsteps echoed, upstairs in uneven patterns, the boy thought again of the whisper. It had not faded, it was still there, still carrying his name, but now it felt less like a mystery and more like a promise that life would not rush him, that he could grow at the pace of the stars, slow and certain, with light that traveled farther than anyone expected. And as he drifted towards sleep that night, he understood something small but profound, that his strength was not in changing others, but in being the still place where others might finally rest. The whisper returned once more, soft as breath, steady as heartbeat, and the boy let it carry him into dreams that felt less like escape and more like coming home. Sleep did not come to him in one piece that night. It arrived in fragments, like pages torn from a book and scattered across the floor, each dream half-formed, but warm at the edges. He saw his mother's hands arranging sandwiches that turned into stars, his sister's laughter spilling across a field of quiet grass, his grandfather's eyes reflecting galaxies he was too young to name. He drifted in and out, carried by a tide that was neither fully real nor entirely imagined, until dawn unfolded itself against the curtains, and the day began again with its quiet insistence. The morning light was softer than usual, almost apologetic, slipping through the blinds in careful slats. He woke with a sense that something in him had stretched overnight, not his limbs, but something subtler, a patience that seemed larger than before. The whisper that had once come only from the sky now lingered inside him, as if it had found a home there. He carried it with him into the kitchen, where the house was stirring with its familiar disarray. His mother was at the sink, her shoulders tired but steady, while his sister moved like a restless breeze from chair to chair, humming under her breath as though she could bend the day into her own rhythm. Rick had not yet appeared. The absence was its own presence, the way silence becomes louder the longer it lasts. The boys sat quietly at the table, watching the way the light caught in his mother's hair, the way his sister tapped her foot against the floor, keeping time with no one else's music. He wondered, as he often did, how each of them carried their hidden burdens, and why he felt compelled to hold space for them all. It wasn't obligation, it was something deeper, as if the universe had given him this small role, to be the pause, the breath, the waiting stillness between other people's storms. Later that day, he followed his sister into the yard, where the late summer heat pressed against their skin. She had been teasing him about something at school, words quick and sharp, yet her eyes gave her away. Behind her mockery was a weariness she didn't want anyone to name. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He simply stood beside her, letting the silence work. She grew quieter, as though the edge in her voice had nowhere left to land. And in that quiet, she admitted without admitting that things at home, at school, in her own restless chest, were heavier than she wanted to carry. She didn't say the words. She didn't have to. He heard them anyway. That evening, Rick returned. His entrance was sudden, as always, like weather breaking without warning. He carried something small and glowing, an invention not yet explained, its hum filling the air with a strange comfort. He set it on the counter, muttering equations under his breath, and for a moment the kitchen felt charged, alive, suspended, between chaos and discovery. The boy watched from the doorway, sensing the tension woven through his grandfather's movements. There was brilliance there, yes, but also an ache that no invention could erase. The boy didn't reach for it. He simply watched, waiting, holding space the way he always did, and in that waiting he realized Rick noticed him. Not fully, not with words, but with a glance that lingered one heartbeat longer than usual. It was enough to keep hope alive. Night drew near. The boy stepped outside again, the sky vast above him. He thought about the way his sister leaned against him without saying why, the way his mother's quiet labor held the family together, the way his grandfather's brilliance flickered like a star, both near and impossibly far. He thought about his own place among them, not as the loudest, not as the strongest, but as the still center that gave everything else room to move. The whisper returned, patient and soft, and he realized it was no longer just something he heard. It was something he had become. The stars above shifted slowly, carrying their secrets across the night, and he let his breathing match their pace. He felt himself stretch again, not outward, but inward, until his heart seemed wide enough to hold them all. And as sleep came to claim him once more, he understood with quiet certainty that his journey was not to change the people he loved, but to remind them, simply by being there, that they had always been enough. The night that followed carried a peculiar stillness, as though the air itself had been listening to his thoughts. The boy lay awake longer than usual, the sheets tangled around him, his eyes tracing faint patterns on the ceiling, while the whisper moved like a steady river through his chest. He thought of his sister's laughter layered over her unspoken weariness, of his mother's sighs that seemed stitched into the fabric of the house, of Rick's restless genius spilling like sparks that burned as often as they lit. These thoughts did not disturb him. They settled around him like companions, each one asking only to be acknowledged, not solved. By the time his eyes drifted shut, it felt less like sleep and more like surrender, a giving over to something larger that held him gently in its palms. The morning broke differently, with a hush that clung even as the sun climbed higher. The Yacha boy rose quietly and wandered through the house, barefoot against the cool floorboards. His mother had already left for work, a half-drunk cup of coffee sitting beside a folded dish towel. His sister was still asleep, her room filled with the chaos of clothes and books, her presence noisy even in her absence. Rick's door was closed, faint murmurs leaking through, the rhythm of a man speaking to himself or to the endless equations that refused to leave him alone. The boy stood in the hallway for a while, listening, not intruding, just noticing the layers of life moving on around him. Later, as the day unfolded, Rick emerged with his eyes sharp but tired, carrying papers, marked with lines and shapes the boy could never follow. He placed them on the table and poured a drink, the smell sharp, the glass heavy in his hand. For a moment, he looked at the boy as if he were about to say something important, then shook his head and retreated into silence. The boy didn't press. He knew instinctively that some truths were not ready to be spoken aloud. He stayed at the table a little longer, tracing the edge of one of Rick's diagrams with his finger, feeling the weight of ideas he couldn't understand but somehow respected. In the afternoon, his sister joined him outside, restless energy, spilling into the yard as she kicked at pebbles and muttered complaints about friends who weren't really friends at all. She didn't ask him for advice, but she stayed close, circling the conversation back to nothing, then forward again to everything. He let her talk, his silence steady enough to hold her words without judgment. When she grew tired of speaking, she leaned back against the tree, her eyes closed, and for a brief moment the mask she wore slipped, leaving behind the fragile truth of someone who wanted to be seen without having to explain. He didn't reach out, didn't disturb her pause. He simply stayed, and that was enough. As evening drew near, he found himself again beneath the wide sky, its colors shifting into bruised shades of purple and gold. The whisper returned, stronger now, threading through his thoughts like a promise. He wondered if it had always been there, waiting for him to notice, or if it had arrived only because he had finally become still enough to hear it. The stars began their slow unveiling, one after another, each a patient lantern in the dark. He breathed with them, his chest rising and falling in time with the endless rhythm above. Rick stepped outside then, the smell of his workshop clinging to his clothes, his gaze tilted toward the horizon as though measuring the distance between galaxies. For a moment the boy thought he might speak, but instead Rick only exhaled long and low, and the silence between them felt like something almost holy. They stood together without words, two figures bound not by explanations, but by presence. It was in that silence the boy realized that love did not always arrive dressed as affection. Sometimes it appeared as a glance, as a shared stillness, as the simple act of not walking away. When the night deepened, the boy returned to his room and sat at the window, watching the world fold into its darker self. He thought again of the way everything stretched, time, shadows, silence, even love. And he felt a quiet certainty that his life, however strange, would always be about making space for others to rest. The whisper hummed through him one last time before sleep claimed him, and as his eyes closed, he carried with him the tender weight of belonging to a family both fractured and whole, knowing that his gift was not to mend them, but to remind them that even broken things could glow. The days passed without urgency, one blending into the next, like soft waves on a quiet shore. The boy had grown used to the rhythm of his life, slow, unspoken, but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't fully name. He felt the stretch of time around him, the way moments hung in the air, like dew on a spider's web, delicate, yet strong enough to hold all the weight of what came before. The whisper, ever present, had become less a sound and more a presence, a constant companion that hummed quietly inside his chest, wrapping itself around his heart and thoughts. It wasn't until one afternoon when the sun hung low and warm that he realized how much he had changed. His sister, who had always been the loud, fast-moving storm in their home, was quieter than usual. She had her own way of being restless, now more subdued, as if she too felt the pull of something beyond their small world. She had stopped asking him about school or about the friends who weren't really friends, and in the space left behind, they shared the kind of silence that only comes after long stretches of knowing someone without needing to fill the quiet with words. Rick had been absent for a few days, consumed by whatever chaos he had conjured in his mind, and the boy had grown used to the absence, though it weighed heavier than he would admit. The house felt thinner without his grandfather's brilliance. There was less mess, less movement, but also less light. And still the boy stayed, his stillness a counterpoint to the absence, as if by remaining unchanged he could fill the space Rick had left behind. That evening, as the boy sat by the window, the sky dipped into twilight, casting long shadows across the yard. He thought about how time felt slower now, stretching with an ease he had never noticed before. There was a comfort in the slowness, in the quiet that settled over everything. He had grown into it, this waiting, this understanding that life would come to him when it was ready. The whisper seemed to agree, its rhythm deepening, as though the universe itself was breathing with him. His mother returned from work, her tired smile lighting up her face in the way it always did when she saw him. She didn't say much, but he could feel the weight of her day in the way her shoulders sagged and the way she pressed her hand against her forehead as if she could erase the exhaustion from her bones. Without a word, he moved toward her and set the kettle on for tea, the ritual of it both simple and profound. She didn't protest, didn't ask him why he did these things. She simply allowed him to take care of her in the only way he knew how. As the evening deepened, the boy's thoughts wandered back to his sister. She had become something different, not in the way she moved, but in the quiet spaces between her words. It was as if she were carrying a weight she didn't want to share, and though he didn't ask, he could feel it in the air when they were together. He had always known her as someone who could stand alone, whose confidence came from being heard, but now she was quieter, her voice smaller, softer. The boy realized with a kind of quiet clarity that she was looking for something she hadn't yet found, just as he was. Later, in the silence of his room, he thought about his place in all of this. He had always felt like the one who waited, the one who watched, the one who stretched out in the quiet spaces that others rushed through. But now, in the deepening dusk, he wondered if there was more to it. Was he just the stillness in the storm, or was he the quiet strength that allowed the storm to be itself without breaking? The whisper inside him seemed to stir, almost as if answering his unspoken question. Yes, it said. You are the quiet, but you are also the breath that holds it all together. He allowed that thought to sit with him, to grow as the night pressed on. The sky outside had darkened completely, but the stars had not yet appeared. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. And in that waiting, the boy understood something deeper. He was not here to fix the world around him or to make it better. He was here to hold it, to let it unfold as it needed to, without interference. His stillness, his quiet, was not a weakness. It was a kind of strength, a kind of wisdom that didn't demand anything but simply allowed. The soft hum of the whisper filled the room, steady and calm, and the boy closed his eyes. He felt it, this small, sure truth. He was exactly where he needed to be. And in that moment, with the quiet of the night wrapping itself around him, he realized that he had never truly been alone. Even when the house felt empty, even when the sky seemed too vast, there was always something watching, something waiting, something holding space. And that was enough. The next morning, the boy awoke with the same quiet sense of being that had settled in his chest the night before. But something had shifted. The air felt fuller, somehow more tangible. He could hear his sister moving around in the other room, the scrape of her shoes against the floor, the soft murmur of her voice as she muttered to herself. The house was waking up with the same gentle rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of water from the faucet, the slow stretch of time that filled the space between moments. It all felt familiar, yet there was a new layer to it, something beneath the surface he couldn't quite place. He stood up slowly, his feet bare against the cool floor, and walked toward the window. Outside, the day was breaking into shades of gold and amber, the light spilling over the yard in long, soft beams. For a moment, he simply watched it, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. The world seemed so still, so peaceful, but he knew deep down that things were quietly changing. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was the world itself. He couldn't tell, but the feeling of waiting, of something just beyond reach, lingered in his chest. Downstairs, his mother was already at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. She didn't look up when he entered, but there was something in the way her hands held the cup, something fragile in her stillness. He knew she carried burdens he would never fully understand, just as she carried a love for him that he could never quite return, in the way she wanted. There were gaps between them, invisible but real, and he had always known that silence could fill them in ways words never could. The kettle whistled, breaking the quiet, and he moved toward it automatically, pouring water over the tea leaves, watching the steam rise and swirl. The house felt like it was breathing with him, moving at its own pace, and in that moment he realized how much he had become a part of it. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was part of the quiet rhythm, the pulse that ran through the walls and the floors, the way the light changed from hour to hour, the way the shadows stretched as the sun moved across the sky. His sister joined them at the table a few minutes later, her hair still damp from the shower, her face flushed from the morning's rush. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. There was a comfort in the way they sat together, not speaking, but simply sharing space. It wasn't the loud, chaotic togetherness they had once known, but something quieter, something more deliberate. The boy couldn't help but notice the change in her, the way she seemed to have grown into herself in ways he hadn't expected. It was subtle, but it was there, like the first hint of a new season. After breakfast, the boy found himself drawn outside again, as though the yard, the sky, the trees called to him in a way that nothing else could. He sat on the porch, his feet dangling off the edge, and let his mind wander. He thought about the space he held between his family, the quiet anchor in their chaotic lives, the way he had learned to stretch without breaking. He had never asked for this role, never intended to become the one who waited, but it had become his way, his purpose, whether he fully understood it or not. It wasn't until one afternoon when the sun hung low and warm that he realized how much he had changed. His sister, who had always been the loud, fast-moving storm in their home, was quieter than usual. She had her own way of being restless, now more subdued, as if she too felt the pull of something beyond their small world. She had stopped asking him about school or about the friends who weren't really friends, and in the space left behind, they shared the kind of silence that only comes after long stretches of knowing someone without needing to fill the quiet with words. Rick had been absent for a few days, consumed by whatever chaos he had conjured in his mind, and the boy had grown used to the absence, though it weighed heavier than he would admit. The house felt thinner without his grandfather's brilliance. There was less mess, less movement, but also less light. And still the boy stayed, his stillness a counterpoint to the absence, as if by remaining unchanged he could fill the space Rick had left behind. That evening, as the boy sat by the window, the sky dipped into twilight, casting long shadows across the yard. He thought about how time felt slower now, stretching with an ease he had never noticed before. There was a comfort in the slowness, in the quiet that settled over everything. He had grown into it, this waiting, this understanding that life would come to him when it was ready. The whisper seemed to agree, its rhythm deepening, as though the universe itself was breathing with him. His mother returned from work, her tired smile lighting up her face in the way it always did when she saw him. She didn't say much, but he could feel the weight of her day in the way her shoulders sagged and the way she pressed her hand against her forehead, as if she could erase the exhaustion from her bones. Without a word, he moved toward her and set the kettle on for tea, the ritual of it both simple and profound. She didn't protest, didn't ask him why he did these things. She simply allowed him to take care of her in the only way he knew how. As the evening deepened, the boy's thoughts wandered back to his sister. She had become something different, not in the way she moved, but in the quiet spaces between her words. It was as if she were carrying a weight she didn't want to share, and though he didn't ask, he could feel it in the air when they were together. He had always known her as someone who could stand alone, whose confidence came from being heard, but now she was quieter, her voice smaller, softer. The boy realized with a kind of quiet clarity that she was looking for something she hadn't yet found, just as he was. Later, in the silence of his room, he thought about his place in all of this. He had always felt like the one who waited, the one who watched, the one who stretched out in the quiet spaces that others rushed through. But now, in the deepening dusk, he wondered if there was more to it. Was he just the stillness in the storm, or was he the quiet strength that allowed the storm to be itself without breaking? The whisper inside him seemed to stir, almost as if answering his unspoken question. "Yes," it said. "You are the quiet, but you are also the breath that holds it all together." He allowed that thought to sit with him, to grow as the night pressed on. The sky outside had darkened completely, but the stars had not yet appeared. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet arrived. And in that waiting, the boy understood something deeper. He was not here to fix the world around him or to make it better. He was here to hold it, to let it unfold as it needed to, without interference. His stillness, his quiet, was not a weakness. It was a kind of strength a kind of wisdom that didn't demand anything but simply allowed. The soft hum of the whisper filled the room, steady and calm, and the boy closed his eyes. He felt it, this small, sure truth. He was exactly where he needed to be. And in that moment, with the quiet of the night wrapping itself around him, he realized that he had never truly been alone. Even when the house felt empty, even when the sky seemed too vast, there was always something watching, something waiting, something holding space. And that was enough. The next morning, the boy awoke with the same quiet sense of being that had settled in his chest the night before. But something had shifted. The air felt fuller, somehow more tangible. He could hear his sister moving around in the other room, the scrape of her shoes against the floor, the soft murmur of her voice as she muttered to herself. The house was waking up with the same gentle rhythm, the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of water from the faucet, the slow stretch of time that filled the space between moments. It all felt familiar, yet there was a new layer to it, something beneath the surface he couldn't quite place. He stood up slowly, his feet bare against the cool floor, and walked toward the window. Outside, the day was breaking into shades of gold and amber, the light spilling over the yard in long, soft beams. For a moment, he simply watched it, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. The world seemed so still, so peaceful, but he knew deep down that things were quietly changing. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was the world itself. He couldn't tell, but the feeling of waiting, of something just beyond reach, lingered in his chest. Downstairs, his mother was already at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. She didn't look up when he entered, but there was something in the way her hands held the cup, something fragile in her stillness. He knew she carried burdens he would never fully understand, just as she carried a love for him that he could never quite return in the way she wanted. There were gaps between them, invisible but real, and he had always known that silence could fill them in ways words never could. The kettle whistled, breaking the quiet, and he moved toward it automatically, pouring water over the tea leaves, watching the steam rise and swirl. The house felt like it was breathing with him, moving at its own pace, and in that moment he realized how much he had become a part of it. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was part of the quiet rhythm, the pulse that ran through the walls and the floors, the way the light changed from hour to hour, the way the shadows stretched as the sun moved across the sky. His sister joined them at the table a few minutes later, her hair still damp from the shower, her face flushed from the morning's rush. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. There was a comfort in the way they sat together, not speaking, but simply sharing space. It wasn't the loud, chaotic togetherness they had once known, but something quieter, something more deliberate. The boy couldn't help but notice the change in her, the way she seemed to have grown into herself in ways he hadn't expected. It was subtle, but it was there, like the first hint of a new season. After breakfast, the boy found himself drawn outside again, as though the yard, the sky, the trees called to him in a way that nothing else could. He sat on the porch, his feet dangling off the edge, and let his mind wander. He thought about the space he held between his family, the quiet anchor in their chaotic lives, the way he had learned to stretch without breaking. He had never asked for this role, never intended to become the one who waited, but it had become his way, his purpose, whether he fully understood it or not. The whisper returned then, louder this time, as if it had been waiting for him to acknowledge it. It wasn't a sound, not really, but a feeling, a presence in his chest that spread outward, wrapping around his heart like a soft blanket. It told him something without words, something he hadn't fully grasped before. His stillness wasn't a weakness. It wasn't something to be fixed or changed. It was his strength. It was the way he held space for others, the way he allowed the world to unfold at its own pace, even when it seemed like everything was moving too fast. He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush against his face, the sound of the leaves rustling in the trees like a lullaby. He didn't need to understand it all, didn't need to control it. He simply needed to be here, in this moment, breathing with the world, breathing with his family. And in that quiet, he realized that he had always been enough. His presence, his stillness, had always been the one thing that had held them together, even when they couldn't see it themselves. When he opened his eyes, the sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the yard. He could hear his sister's voice calling from inside, and the quiet of the morning had already begun to give way to the rush of the afternoon. But for now, he stayed where he was, holding on to the stillness, knowing that everything would continue to unfold in its own time. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need to fix anything. All he had to do was breathe. The next few days slipped by with a kind of quiet momentum, each moment quietly stretching into the next, as if time itself had softened its edges. The boy moved through his days with a sense of presence that surprised him, noticing things he had never seen before. The way the sun filtered through the leaves in the late afternoon, the smell of rain on the earth after a summer storm, the way his sister's voice, though often distant, carried the weight of something unspoken. The world around him seemed to pulse with a rhythm that only he could feel, and he began to wonder if it was his own heartbeat that had become so attuned to everything else. One evening, as the sky began to turn the color of bruises, his sister called him outside. She stood in the doorway, the fading light casting long shadows across her face. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something in her eyes before she stepped aside and gestured for him to join her. He didn't ask why. He simply followed her out into the yard, where the air had taken on the stillness that usually came just before the world exhaled. They didn't speak at first. The boy stood beside her, feeling the cool grass beneath his feet, watching the way. The clouds drifted lazily across the sky. He could sense something stirring between them, a shift in the air that hadn't been there before. His sister was different, no longer the whirlwind that she had once been, but not entirely the quiet stranger she sometimes became. She was somewhere in between, caught in the spaces that neither of them knew how to fill. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but he heard it clearly. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something? Like the world's moving, but you're just stuck in one place, watching it all go by?" The boy turned to her, feeling the weight of her question settle between them. He didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure how to, or even if there was an answer to give. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze drifting back to the sky. He understood exactly what she meant. There had always been a part of him that felt as though he was waiting for something, waiting for the world to unfold in a way that made sense, waiting for the quiet to settle into something more. He had never quite realized how much he had been waiting, or how much of his life had been lived in anticipation of something that never seemed to come. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, a space they had always shared without needing to fill it. The boy felt the weight of her presence beside him, felt how much she had changed, how much he had changed. He had never quite known how to help her, how to bridge the gap between them. But now, standing beside her in the growing darkness, he realized that perhaps it wasn't about fixing anything at all. Maybe it was about simply being here, sharing the space between them and letting it be enough. She looked at him then, her eyes soft in the dim light.
"I don't know if I'm ready for anything," she said, her voice quieter now, like the last breath of a storm passing. "But maybe it's okay not to be. Maybe we don't have to have it all figured out." The boy didn't respond right.
Away. He wasn't sure what to say, but he knew that this, whatever this was, felt important. It wasn't a solution, it wasn't an answer, but it was something that allowed them to stand together in the dark without needing to fix anything, and somehow that felt like enough. The night deepened, and the first star appeared, faint but steady. The boy thought about the quiet wisdom in his sister's words, how they echoed his own thoughts in ways he hadn't realized. They weren't ready, not for all the answers, but maybe that was all right. Maybe the waiting itself was part of the journey. Maybe it was enough to simply breathe through it, to hold the space without rushing forward. He felt the whisper stir inside him again, a soft reminder that it was all part of the same rhythm. He didn't have to know what came next. He didn't have to understand the spaces between moments. All he had to do was be present, just as he was now, standing with his sister under the vast, unfolding sky. And in that quiet, shared moment, the weight of waiting seemed to lift just a little. The days that followed were quiet, but they carried a new weight, a deeper understanding between the boy and his sister. There was a soft shift in the air when they were together, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been unsaid before. They didn't need to speak to know the other was there, didn't need to fill the silence with explanations or questions. Instead, they let it be, an unspoken agreement that there was comfort in simply existing together, in being present without expectation. But still, the boy could feel it, the waiting. It lingered in the air like a thread that had not yet been pulled, a song that hadn't quite reached its final note. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that something was coming, something that had been building beneath the surface. It was a quiet kind of tension, not a storm, but the stillness before one, the feeling that everything was in place, waiting for the moment to move. He spent a lot of time outside, his eyes drawn to the changing sky. The sunset seemed to stretch, longer now, the colors fading slowly, lingering in the horizon as if the world itself was taking its time. He would sit on the porch, his feet tucked beneath him, and watch the stars come alive one by one until the night wrapped itself around the world like a blanket. And in those moments he thought about his place in it all. He wasn't waiting for something big, something world-changing. He was waiting for the small, quiet moments, the kind that came when you least expected them, the kind that shaped you without needing to announce themselves. One evening, as the air began to cool and the light faded into dusk, he found himself walking down the street, his feet moving on their own, taking him where he didn't know he was going. His sister was inside, her own thoughts swirling in a way he couldn't quite reach, and his mother had disappeared into the quiet of the house, her presence a soft hum in the background. It was just him now, the quiet pull of the night guiding him forward. He walked for what felt like hours, his mind free of the usual clutter, and with each step he felt the tension in his chest ease. It wasn't a solution, not exactly, but it was something. A small shift, a deepening of understanding. He stopped at the edge of the park, the one they had passed countless times, but this time it felt different. The trees loomed overhead, their branches stretching out like fingers reaching into the sky, and the grass beneath his feet was soft and damp from the evening dew. He sat down on a bench, his hands resting on his knees, and looked around. The world seemed still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something that hadn't come yet. But in that stillness, he found a strange kind of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from solving something or figuring out the next step. It was the kind that came from simply being, from allowing the moment to unfold without interference. He didn't know how long he sat there. Time had a way of bending in these quiet moments, stretching out until it felt like there was no end. The stars began to appear, slowly at first, then all at once, as if the sky itself had decided to let go. The boy smiled softly to himself, a sense of gratitude rising in his chest. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to understand everything. For once, just sitting in the quiet was enough. When he finally stood up to leave, the sky had turned to ink, the stars bright against the vast emptiness. He walked back home slowly, the world around him still, but full of the unspoken promise of things to come. It was a quiet knowing, a sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, even if he couldn't quite explain why. As he entered the house, he found his sister sitting at the table, her eyes turned toward the window, her thoughts distant. She didn't look up when he entered, but the boy could feel the change in her too, the way she had started to settle into herself, just like he was learning to do. Without a word, he sat down beside her, letting the silence stretch between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just enough, just like everything else in their lives. The world didn't always need to be loud to be real. And tonight, in the quiet of their home, the boy understood that sometimes waiting wasn't about what you were waiting for. It was about trusting that when the time came, you would be ready, even without knowing what it was. The days bled into one another, a seamless stretch of time where the boy's life had become less about what happened and more about how it felt to be. There was a certain stillness that hung in the air, as though the entire world had paused, waiting for something to break the silence. The seasons were shifting around him, the small markers of change barely perceptible but undeniable, the first cool breeze of fall, the way the leaves had begun to yellow at the edges, the quiet hum of the earth turning toward rest. He found himself walking more, his feet carrying him without thought, taking the long way home or stepping out just to breathe in the dusk. He was learning to notice the details that had once slipped past him, the way the shadows grew longer in the evenings, the smell of wood smoke that seemed to linger in the air when the sun set, the way his sister's laughter sounded softer, as if the world had begun to fold around her. But despite the calm that had settled in, there was something unsettled about it all. It wasn't an urgent restlessness, but more a quiet gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He could feel the waiting still, a sense that the next moment, the next shift, was just beyond the horizon, out of sight but close enough to feel its pull. He wasn't sure if it was something he was waiting for or something he was becoming. His mother had grown quieter too, her sighs more frequent, her eyes distant even when she smiled. He noticed it in the way she moved around the house, small, almost imperceptible shifts in her routine that told him she was carrying something, but it wasn't his to ask about. Instead, he watched her with a kind of quiet reverence, giving her space without needing to fill the silence. It was late one evening, just as the sky had turned that soft shade of navy blue, when he found himself sitting outside again, the cool evening air wrapping around him. His sister was inside, her voice muffled through the walls, her laughter carrying an edge of something he couldn't quite place. It was the first time in a long while that he had been alone with the thought that had been gnawing at him for days. It was a question without an answer, something he had never really voiced, but had always known to be there. Why was he waiting? He had grown comfortable in the stillness, in the silence that had become part of him, but now the quiet felt different. It wasn't a peace anymore. It was a weight, a heavy kind of pause that seemed to stretch into infinity. He had always been content in his place, the one who stood at the edge of things, who let life unfold around him. But now, it felt like there was more to it, more he hadn't yet understood. The stars blinked down at him from above, their light steady, almost knowing. He wondered if they had always known this about him, that he was built for this moment, for this waiting, for the quiet that was meant to shape him into something he had yet to discover. Maybe it wasn't about fixing anything, about finding the answers. Maybe it was about learning to be the still point, the breath between the inhale and the exhale. And just as the thought settled into his chest, something shifted inside him. It was subtle, like the first stirrings of wind before a storm, but it was enough to make him sit up straighter, enough to make him realize that the waiting had never been about him. It had always been about the world, about the people around
him. The door creaked open behind him, and his sister stepped outside, her voice quieter now, her presence more grounded. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him in the soft glow of the porch light. He could feel the change in
her, the shift that mirrored his own, as if they were both stepping into a moment that had been waiting for them. For a long while, they said nothing. They didn't need to. The air between them was filled with an unspoken understanding, a quiet bond that had always been there, but was now becoming something deeper, something more real. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant to be more than just this? More than just living day by day, moving through it all like we're not really here?" The boy turned to her, his heart suddenly heavy with the weight of her question, but also lightened by it. She had voiced what he hadn't known how to ask. Yes, he had wondered, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop waiting for the world, to unfold and start unfolding with it. He didn't answer her right away, not because he didn't know, but because the answer felt bigger than either of them. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, a quiet promise between them that the waiting, the stillness wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And in that moment the world felt fuller, as if something had finally shifted, and the waiting had found its purpose. The days began to blur together, each one unfolding with the same steady rhythm, yet the air around the boy had changed. The question his sister had voiced hung between them, lingering like the last note of a song, not fully answered, but understood. It was in the quiet moments now, when they sat together, or when he walked alone, that he realized how much he had been waiting for something beyond just the passing of time. It wasn't a thing, not a specific event, but a shift, an unfolding of some kind that he hadn't known he needed until it was upon him. He didn't know what he was becoming, only that the world around him felt fuller, like the space between. Breaths had widened. The waiting, once so heavy and confusing, had transformed into something else. It was as if he were finally catching up with himself, learning to live in the moments that had once slipped by unnoticed. He saw things now, his mother's tired smile, his sister's silent gestures, the way the trees in the yard reached out like arms, stretching towards something they could not yet touch. It was all there, right in front of him, waiting to be seen. One afternoon, as the sun sank low and the world began to cool, he found himself sitting in the yard again, his legs crossed beneath him, watching the evening unfold. He hadn't meant to come outside, but something about the air, the way the shadows deepened, had drawn him here. There was a stillness to the world that evening, as though everything was holding its breath, waiting for the night to take hold. Always done. For a while, they simply sat there, breathing together in the quiet, as if time had slowed down just for them. And then, just as the stars began to blink into existence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think—"
We're supposed to be more than this, more than just waiting for something to happen? Her words landed between them with the same weight as before, but this time the boy didn't feel the tension in them. He didn't feel the urgency or
the unknown. Instead, he felt something else, a kind of knowing that he hadn't fully understood until now. He looked at her, his eyes steady, and nodded. "I think we are more than this," he said quietly. "Maybe not in the way we expect, but more in the way we move through things, in how we choose to be here. We're already living it." She didn't respond right away, but he could see the thought settle in her eyes, see the way her shoulders relaxed just a little. She didn't need him to have the answer, just to share in the silence of it, to acknowledge the waiting without trying to fill it. They sat there for a long time, the world around them quieting, as though the night had folded them into itself, letting them be just as they were. As the evening deepened, the boy felt a shift inside him, like the last piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. He hadn't realized it until now, but he had been waiting for this, a moment of understanding, a moment of connection that didn't require solving or figuring out. He didn't need to wait for the world to change. He was part of it already, part of the unfolding, part of the quiet space between the moments. The whisper had become clearer now, less of a presence and more of a truth. It told him, without words, that he was enough just as he was, that waiting didn't mean standing still. It meant being present, being open to what was unfolding, no matter how slowly, no matter how quietly. And as the stars began to fill the sky, as the night grew thick with its deepening silence, the boy understood something he hadn't before. He wasn't waiting for the world to change. He was learning to be the one who changed with it. The world moved around him just as it always had, but now he was a part of it. And that was enough. The days that followed felt both ordinary and profound, as if the boy had learned to see the world through a lens that had always been there, but never quite in focus. Time still passed, but now it felt less like a rushing river and more like the ebb and flow of the tides, calm, inevitable, yet full of possibility in its rhythm. The quiet moments of his life became the loudest, the small exchanges with his sister, the soft glance from his mother, the silence they shared without need for words. Each morning, the sun still rose in the same patient way, spilling its light over the house and the yard, casting long shadows as it climbed higher in the sky. The boy felt the pull of it, the steady pulse of the day that held everything in place, and yet he knew that something had shifted within him. He no longer felt the weight of waiting. Instead, there was a quiet trust in what came next, as if the world didn't need to be understood to be lived, only experienced. His sister continued to change, to grow into herself in ways that surprised him. She was no longer the whirlwind of energy that she had been, no longer the one who pulled everyone along in her wake. Now there was a calmness to her, a depth that he hadn't noticed before. It was in the way she moved through the world with less urgency, less noise. He saw it in her when she spoke less, but listened more, when she didn't demand answers, but allowed the questions to settle. One evening, they found themselves together again in the quiet of the yard, both watching the sky as the stars began to appear one by one. She sat beside him close enough that he could feel her presence without needing to say anything. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared silence enough to fill the space between them. And then, without warning, she turned to him, her eyes soft and thoughtful. "I think I'm finally starting to understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were fragile. That waiting, the feeling like we're
stuck. It's not that we're waiting for something to happen. It's about letting things happen.
It's about being ready for them when they do, without forcing them. The boy turned to her, feeling the depth of her words settle in his chest. He nodded, the quiet understanding between them deepening. He didn't have the words to express it, but he understood. The waiting wasn't the problem. It was the resistance to the flow, the belief that something needed to change for it to be enough. He had been learning that lesson in his own way, but hearing it from her, in that moment, made it feel as though a door had opened inside him. For a while, they both sat in the stillness, the sound of the night wrapping around them. The world was so quiet, so patient, and yet everything felt alive, pulsing with meaning that they had only begun to understand. The boy realized that for the first time he wasn't waiting for something to happen. He was simply allowing himself to be part of it, to move with it, to breathe in the moments without needing to control them. As the night stretched on, they stayed there together, the air growing cooler, the stars overhead a constant reminder
of the vastness of the world and how small their worries really were.
The boy felt a sense of peace that he had never known before, a peace that didn't come from solving anything, but from letting things unfold naturally. He didn't know what the future held, what moments awaited him, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to rush toward them. He didn't need to chase after answers or fix things that weren't broken. He simply needed to be, to breathe, to trust that the world would show him what it had in store, in its own time. And in that trust, in that letting go, he found the freedom he had been waiting for all along. The days that followed were filled with the kind of peace that comes only when you've let go of expectations. The boy found himself sinking deeper into the quiet, learning to move through the world with less urgency, less need to control it. It was an odd kind of freedom, the freedom of letting life unfold without trying to force it into shape. He spent more time outside, feeling the changing seasons on his skin, listening to the sounds of the earth, leaves rustling in the wind, birds singing their quiet songs, the steady hum of the world turning. He and his sister had begun to share more moments like the one they had shared in the yard, their bond growing stronger in its quiet way. They didn't need to talk as much anymore, didn't need to fill the silence with words. They simply existed together, their presence enough for one another. The weight of their shared understanding, their shared waiting, had become something lighter, something that allowed them to be more fully themselves. Even his mother seemed to shift, though it was a slower transformation. Her tired smiles became a little more frequent, and the tension in her shoulders seemed to ease. The boy noticed the small things now, the way she would hum softly as she worked, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the way her presence filled the room. without demanding attention. He didn't know if she had realized it yet, but she had found a way to settle into herself again, to let the world move around her without needing to control it. One evening, as the sky grew dark and the stars began to twinkle above them, the boy found himself alone, in the yard again. The night had a certain stillness to it, a quiet peace that seemed to settle over everything. He could hear the distant sounds of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind, but beyond that there was only the soft, steady
rhythm of his own breathing.
It was as if the world had paused just for him, giving him a moment to catch up, to simply exist without any pressure to do anything else. He sat on the grass, his back against the cool ground, his eyes fixed on the sky. The stars had always fascinated
him, their steady presence in the vastness of the night sky. They were so far away, yet they felt so close, like they were a part of him, always present, always watching.
It was in these moments, when the world seemed to hold its breath, that he realized how small he was in the grand scheme of things. And yet, in that smallness, he also felt deeply connected to everything around him. As he lay there, the quiet settling deeper into him, he thought about how much he had changed. He had spent so much of his life waiting, trying to make sense of everything, trying to fit into a world that never quite seemed to make sense. But now, the waiting didn't feel as heavy. It didn't feel like something that needed to be fixed or solved. Instead, it felt like part of the rhythm of life, part of the natural flow of things. He no longer felt the need to force things to happen. He had learned, in his own quiet way, to let go and allow things to unfold as they were meant to. The air grew cooler as the night deepened, and the boy sat up, brushing the grass from his hands. He wasn't sure how long he had been lying there, but it didn't matter. Time had taken on a different meaning for him now, moving in its own quiet rhythm, unhurried, unforced. As he stood and made his way back toward the house, he felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him. He wasn't waiting for something to change. He wasn't waiting for the world to give him an answer. He had already found what he was looking for, and it wasn't in the distant future or in some far-off event. It was in the here and now, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between breaths. And in that quiet, he realized that he was enough, just as he was. The night stretched on, the stars shining steadily above him, and the boy felt the weight of the world, not as something heavy, but as something light, something he could hold gently in his hands. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be fully alive, fully present, without needing to know what came next. The following days carried with them an unspoken tranquility, a rhythm that the boy found comforting, yet unfamiliar. His sister, who had once been the storm in their home, seemed to have settled into a quietude that mirrored his own. There were fewer questions between them, fewer words at all, yet their bond deepened without them needing to express it. They simply shared space, lived in the same moments, and it was enough. He had come to understand that perhaps, in the end, it wasn't about changing the world or even knowing the answers. It was about being present for it, for each small shift, for each breath that connected them all. He spent more time now walking in the mornings, just as the sun began to break through the horizon, casting soft pinks and oranges across the sky. The cool air filled his lungs, refreshing and quiet. And for the first time, he noticed how every small detail seemed to hold weight. The way the trees stood at the edge of the forest, their leaves shifting with the breeze. The small, unspoken rhythm of life waking up around him, the laughter of a child from a neighboring house, echoing through the streets like a soft melody. It was as if everything had always been here, just waiting for him to notice, waiting for him to slow down enough to let it in. His mother too had changed. Her movements were gentler now, as if the weight she had carried for so long had lightened, just enough for her to breathe. She spent more time in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared meals, the sound of it a subtle comfort that settled over the house. The boy often found himself in the kitchen late in the afternoon, sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. They would talk, but not in the hurried way they once did, not in the way they tried to fill every silence with words. Now the silences between them were more like pauses, small moments of connection filled with understanding. One evening, after dinner, the boy found himself outside again, standing on the porch, watching the night settle in. The stars were bright above him, their steady presence comforting in the vastness of the sky. He hadn't felt the pull of the waiting for days now, but as he stood there, the quiet of the night wrapping itself around him, he realized that the waiting wasn't gone. It had simply transformed like everything else. It was no longer an aching emptiness. It was a calm expectancy, a gentle understanding that whatever came next, whatever unfolded, would come in its own time. He didn't need to rush toward it. He didn't need to push for it. Everything had its own pace, its own rhythm. The sky didn't rush to change colors. The trees didn't hurry to grow. They simply were. And in that simplicity, the boy found peace. As he turned to go back inside, he heard a soft sound behind him, the creak of the door as it opened, and his sister stepped out onto the porch, her eyes lifted to the sky. She didn't say anything, but there was a kind of quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the stillness they had both found. She stood beside him, her presence steady, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had learned, without words, that silence could be a bridge, not a gap. They watched the stars together, the night deepening around them, and the boy felt, for the first time, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. There were no questions left to answer, no answers left to seek. Everything was unfolding in its own way, and that was enough. The days drifted by, each one carrying a quiet weight that seemed to settle deeper with every passing hour. The boy, now accustomed to the stillness, no longer felt as though he was waiting for something to change. It was as if he had finally accepted the ebb and flow of life around him, trusting in its rhythm without needing to control it. There were no grand revelations, no sudden bursts of insight, but rather a slow, continuous unfolding, like the gradual unfolding of a flower in the morning light. His sister had begun spending more time in the garden, a place she had once avoided in favor
of her restless energy.
Now she tended to the small patches of earth with a kind of quiet focus that mirrored his own. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were soft, not filled with the urgency they once had. There was a gentleness to her now, a kind of peace that made him feel less alone in his own quiet transformation. She still carried her burdens, of course, as they all did, but there was something different in the way she bore them, a quiet resilience he hadn't seen before. The house, too, had settled into a different rhythm. The sounds of it, dishes clinking in the sink, the soft murmur of the radio in the background, had become comforting, almost like a lullaby. His mother's presence had softened as well, the sharpness that had once filled her movements now, replaced by a calm, patient ease. She still carried the weight of her world, but it was no longer heavy in the way it once had been. She had learned, as he had, to breathe through it, to let go of the need to fix everything. They were all learning in their own quiet ways to simply be. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the boy found himself outside again, this time near the edge of the yard where the shadows stretched long across the grass. The air was cool, the first hint of fall in the breeze that brushed against his skin. He could hear his sister humming softly to herself in the distance, the sound carrying on the wind like a whispered secret. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle over him. And in that silence, something stirred. Something he hadn't expected, something that felt both familiar and new. It was the pull of something deeper, a feeling that had been lingering at the edges of his awareness, but one he hadn't yet understood. He felt it now, as if the world around him had paused, waiting for him to recognize it. It wasn't a specific moment or event. It wasn't the answer to any question he had asked. It was simply the realization that he had come full circle, that the waiting had never been about the world changing, but about him changing with it. He didn't need to chase after answers anymore. He didn't need to search for meaning in the spaces between the moments. The meaning was there, already woven into the fabric of his life, in the small, ordinary things. The way his sister's presence had become a quiet comfort, the way his mother's tired smile had softened over time, the way the house itself had come to feel like a place of rest rather than a place of expectation. For the first time in a long while, the boy felt truly at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because he had stopped trying to make it so. He had stopped looking for the answers and had learned to simply exist in the moment, to be present without needing to fix anything. He had become part of the
rhythm of life, not apart from it. And in that connection he found the stillness he had always longed for. As he turned to walk back to the house, the first star appeared in the sky, its light steady and bright against the darkening blue.
He paused for a moment, looking up at it, and for the first time he understood that the world didn't need to be fixed. It didn't need to be understood. It simply needed to be. And so did he. The quiet peace that had settled over the boy and his family was not perfect, but it was real. Life moved on as it always did, but now it was a steady current rather than the rushing river it had once been. Each day felt like a continuation of something important, even if it was something small. He found himself waking with the sun, not out of obligation, but out of a simple appreciation for the newness each day brought, even in its most ordinary moments. His sister had grown more reserved, but in a way that didn't feel distant. She still carried her restlessness, but now it was accompanied by a quiet grace, like someone who had learned to make peace with the spaces inside her. He saw it most when she worked in the garden, her hands moving with purpose, but with a kind of tenderness that told him she was planting more than just seeds. She was learning to care for the small things, the quiet moments that filled the gaps between the larger ones. His mother, too, seemed to have found her rhythm again. Her presence in the house no longer felt like a constant effort, but a soft, steady pulse. She moved through the days with a calm he hadn't seen before, and he began to notice the small things, how she hummed as she worked, how her eyes softened when she looked at him, how the weight of her tiredness no longer seemed so heavy. There were still hard days, of course, but they no longer dominated her life. She had learned, as he had, to breathe through them, to find moments of peace in the spaces between. One evening, the boy found himself outside again, alone, his back resting against the old oak tree in the yard. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the grass, and the air was filled with the soft hum of insects and the distant call of birds. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the world surround him, and in the stillness he felt something shift. It wasn't a big shift, nothing dramatic or life-changing. It was just a quiet understanding, a realization that he had moved past the waiting. There was no more holding his breath, no more feeling like something was just out of reach. He had found a kind of peace, a stillness, and he was no longer searching for something outside himself to make it real. The world didn't need to be perfect for him to feel at home in it. It only needed to be lived in, moment by moment. His sister came out then, her steps light on the grass. She didn't speak at first, just sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Together they watched the last of the light fade from the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle softly above them. The air was cool now, the evening deepening around them, but the silence was not heavy. It was a shared silence, a space they both had come to understand. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft but sure.
"I think I'm starting to understand too," she said. "That peace you found. It's not something you wait for. It's something you let in, piece by piece." He nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. There had been
so much waiting, so much wondering what would happen next, but now he realized that the next moment would come on its own, just as every other moment had. He didn't need to chase it. He only needed to be here, in this space, breathing in the quiet, letting the world unfold around him. They sat there in the stillness for a long time, not needing to say anything more. The night wrapped around them, the world continuing its slow, steady motion, and the boy finally understood that this quiet, this being present, was enough. He didn't need to know what was coming next. He only needed to be here, right now, with the people he loved, in the peace they had all begun to find together. The rhythm of life continued in its steady pulse, each day a continuation of the one before it, and yet something about it felt different. The boy noticed it in the quiet moments, the way the light shifted as the seasons changed, the way his sister had started to find solace in the small things, and the way his mother's quiet strength had become a kind of anchor in their home. It was as though time had slowed down just enough for them all to breathe, to feel the fullness of the present without rushing to the next moment. The boy had stopped waiting for something to change. He had stopped thinking that peace was something to chase or to be found in the future. It had always been here, in the moments that made up the days, the morning light filtering through the trees, the sound of his sister humming as she worked in the garden, the warm presence of his mother in the kitchen. All of it was peace, already in motion. He simply had to open himself to it, to let it in. One afternoon he found himself sitting alone in the yard again, his back against the oak tree, watching the sunlight dance through the leaves above him. The world felt far away, yet incredibly close, as if the distance between his thoughts and the earth had vanished. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun seep into his skin, feeling the earth beneath him, steady and alive. It was in this stillness, this simple act of being, that he realized how much he had changed. He wasn't the person he had been when he first started waiting, when he first thought he had to search for something outside of himself to make sense of the world. He had come to understand that everything he needed was already here, in the quiet moments, in the way the world unfolded without hurry. His sister appeared then, stepping out of the house, her presence as natural as the air around him. She didn't need to speak at first, simply sitting beside him, her presence a reminder that they had found something together, even without trying. For a while, neither of them said anything, letting the silence fill the space between them, and then, softly, she spoke, her voice carrying a depth that surprised him. "I don't think I'm looking for anything anymore. Not in the way I used to. I think I'm finally starting to feel like I belong here, in this moment, just as it is." The boy nodded, his heart filling with a quiet understanding. He had felt that shift too, the letting go of the search, the release of the pressure to find something more. It wasn't that they had found the answer, it was that they had stopped needing to find it. They were enough, just as they were, in the lives they had built, in the small moments that made up their days. The world around them seemed to pause, as if acknowledging this quiet truth. The air was still, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. The boy felt, for the first time in a long while, that everything was as it should be. There were no grand changes to be made, no answers to chase. They had arrived together in a place of peace, not because of anything they had done, but because they had learned to simply be. As the evening drew closer and the stars began to appear one by one, the boy realized that this too was enough. The waiting, the wondering, the searching, it had all led him here, to this quiet space, to the understanding that everything he had ever needed was already part of his world. All that remained was to continue living it, moment by moment, letting it unfold at its own pace. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the boy smiled softly, knowing that he had finally found what he had been searching for. Not in the world around him, but in himself. The days slipped into weeks with a quiet assurance, each one folding into the next, like the smooth turn of pages in a book. The boy continued to move through his life with an ease he hadn't known before, the stillness inside him now a natural part of the world around him. He woke in the mornings with a sense of clarity, not a rush to accomplish, but a simple understanding that the day would unfold just as it had every day before. There was no pressure to make it different, no need to hurry or force it to be something else. It was enough, just as it was. His sister, too, seemed to find a new rhythm. She had always been restless, but now there was a peace in her, a quiet acceptance of her own presence. She spent more time outdoors tending to the garden, her movements slower, more deliberate. It wasn't about the need to keep moving anymore. It was about being in the moment, feeling the earth beneath her fingers, letting the growth happen naturally. They didn't talk about it, but they both understood. It was the same quiet peace. They had both found the understanding that there was no rush to get anywhere. Life was happening right here, right now. Even his mother, who had always carried the weight of her own world with a quiet resolve, seemed to breathe easier. The house felt lighter, the air a little less heavy. She still had her moments, those quiet sighs of weariness that came with the responsibilities of life, but there was something different in the way she carried them now. She didn't try to fix everything. She didn't have to. She had learned, just as they had, to let go of the need for control, to let life unfold as it would. One evening, after dinner, the boy found himself outside again, the air cool against his skin as the sun dipped low on the horizon. He sat on the porch, his eyes following the path of the fading light across the yard. The stars began to appear, slowly at first, then in clusters, their light steady and bright against the darkening sky. He had always been fascinated by the stars, their constant presence in the vastness of the night. They were so far away, yet they felt so close, like they were a part of him, watching over him. His sister came out then, sitting beside him without saying a word. They had found this quiet companionship, this space where no words were needed, and it had become enough. She looked up at the sky, her gaze following his, and for a long time neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. The world in that moment felt full, complete, without needing to be anything more. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with understanding, with the shared presence of two people who had come to realize that everything they had been searching for was right here, in the quiet spaces. Finally, his sister spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's all just meant to be this way?" The boy turned to her, his eyes soft in the dimming light. He didn't answer right away, not because he didn't know, but because the question itself felt like an answer. It was both everything and nothing all at once. He smiled, the understanding between them deepening without the need for words. "I think it just is," he said, his voice steady, the peace in his chest now a part of his every breath. And that's enough. They sat there together, watching the stars fill the sky, each one steady and unwavering. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Yet there was a deep stillness to it, a calm that filled the air with an unspoken promise that everything, in its own time, would find its way. And for the first time, the boy understood what it meant, to simply let go, to trust that everything was unfolding as it was meant to. There was no rush, no need to push forward. He had everything he needed right here, in the quiet, in the peace. The stars above shone brightly, and for the first time in his life, he felt no need to look away. As the days passed, the boy found himself becoming more attuned to the rhythms of his life, his family, and the world around him. The world, once so full of questions and uncertainties, now seemed to unfold with a quiet grace. He had stopped searching for answers, stopped looking for meaning in every corner of his existence. Instead, he had learned to trust in the process, to trust in the unfolding of each day, no matter how simple or quiet it seemed. His sister had continued to find solace in her own way, growing more comfortable in her own skin. She spent hours in the garden, tending to the plants with a care that seemed to mirror the way she was tending to herself. She had become more patient, more present, as if she had finally begun to embrace the stillness that had once eluded her. They didn't need to speak much anymore. The bond between them had grown stronger in its quiet simplicity. His mother, too, seemed to have found a deeper peace. The weight she had carried for so long had lifted, though it was clear that the responsibilities of life still hung around her. But she had learned, just as the boy had, that not everything needed to be fixed, not everything needed to be perfect. The world didn't require her to hold it together with constant effort. She had begun to find joy in the small things again, the sound of the wind through the trees, the feel of warm water against her hands as she washed the dishes, the soft laughter that sometimes bubbled up unexpectedly. She no longer tried to control everything. She had learned to let go, to breathe through the chaos, and in doing so, she had found a kind of quiet strength. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the boy found himself outside again, sitting on the porch and watching the last traces of light fade from the sky. It was the same ritual he had come to cherish, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath, when everything was still and the stars began to emerge, slow and steady. The night had become his companion, a time of reflection, a time of quiet. His sister joined him, as she often did now, and they sat together in silence, watching the world change in its own time. She didn't speak immediately, and neither did he. The stillness between them was enough, a comfortable space where nothing needed to be explained. She leaned back slightly, her gaze on the stars, and for the first time the boy realized how far they had come. There was no more uncertainty between them, no more waiting. They had arrived at something unspoken, something that needed no words.
"Do you think we've figured it out?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness of the night. The boy thought for a moment, the question hanging in the air like the last note of a song. He didn't have an answer, not really, but he knew something had changed.
They had stopped searching, stopped trying to force the pieces to fit. Instead, they had simply allowed everything to unfold as it would. The waiting had stopped because there was nothing left to wait for. "I think we've always had it," he said quietly, his eyes on the stars. "We just had to stop looking for it." His sister didn't answer immediately, but she didn't need to. The words were enough. They both knew what he meant. They had been searching for something outside themselves, something to give them answers, to make sense of the quiet. But in the end, they had found it in themselves, in the stillness, in the space between the moments. They sat there for a long time, watching the stars slowly fill the sky, each one a quiet reminder of the universe's patience. There was no rush anymore, no need to chase after anything. The world was unfolding exactly as it was meant to, and they were part of it, not apart from it. The night deepened, and the boy felt a quiet sense of contentment wash over him. He didn't need to look for the next moment, the next change. He had everything he needed right here, in the present, in the stillness. He didn't need to know what came next, because he had already arrived. And for the first time, he understood that the waiting wasn't for something outside himself. It was simply for him to catch up with the life he was already living. The rhythm of life continued, slow and steady, as the boy settled into the quiet assurance that had become the fabric of his days. There were still moments of uncertainty, small flickers of doubt that would rise and fall, but they no longer dominated his thoughts. He had come to realize that life wasn't about eliminating those moments. It was about learning to breathe through them, to let them pass without holding
onto them.
It was the same with the world around him. The days flowed into one another without haste, and yet they carried a weight, not heavy but substantial, like the steady passage of a river carving its path through stone. His sister, too, had found her place in it all. She no longer rushed through life with the same frenetic energy. Instead, she seemed to take things in stride, finding peace in the smallest of details. There was something about her now, an openness, a willingness to simply be. It was as if, like him, she had come to understand that peace wasn't something you could chase. It was something you had to allow. One evening, after dinner, the boy found himself alone in the garden, the evening air cool against his skin. He leaned against the old fence, watching as the last slivers of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. It was a familiar moment, quiet, unremarkable, yet filled with a kind of weightless beauty. He thought about how long it had taken him to understand this, how many moments of rushing and searching it had taken for him to come to this simple realization, that life was enough, just as it was. He heard footsteps behind him, soft and sure, and he turned to find his sister standing in the doorway, her eyes bright in the dimming light. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her presence steady and calming, and the boy felt a quiet smile spread across his face. She stepped outside and walked over to where he stood. "Do you think we've been given everything?" we need?" she asked, her voice low, almost as though she were speaking a thought aloud, not expecting an answer. He didn't need to think about it. The answer was there, simple and true. "Yes," he said quietly. "We've always had it. We just had to stop looking for it." She didn't reply immediately, but he could see the understanding in her eyes. They had both found their way here, not because they had solved anything, but because they had let go. They had let go of the need for answers, for more, for something different. What they had, in this moment, was enough. The stars were beginning to appear now, dotting the sky with their steady, unhurried light, and the boy looked up, letting the cool evening air fill his lungs. His sister stood beside him, her gaze following his, both of them drawn into the same quiet awe of the night. The world was vast, but it was also small. Small in the sense that everything they had ever needed had always been with them, in the spaces they had learned to open up to. As they stood there in silence, the boy realized something else. They had found their own peace, together, without needing to force it. Life had brought them here, not through any grand gestures, but through the simple, quiet unfolding of their days. They had stopped searching for the next thing, stopped waiting for the world to change. They had learned to live in the present, to find meaning in the everyday moments that filled their lives. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around them, and for a moment the boy felt the weight of time lift, as if it too had settled into the quiet rhythm of life. The world continued on as it always would, but for now it was enough. There was no rush, no need to chase after something more. They had arrived, not at a destination, but at a place of understanding, of being. And in that quiet, in that shared peace, the boy realized that this was all he needed. Not the answers, not the change, but simply the stillness that allowed him to breathe, to be present, to be whole. As the days continued their gentle flow, the boy began to notice a subtle shift, not just in the world around him, but in the way he carried himself through it. It wasn't a sudden change, but a quiet deepening of something that had always been there. He felt it most in the small moments, the way his hands moved as he helped with chores, the way his thoughts seemed to settle without effort, like stones sinking slowly to the bottom of a calm lake. Life had become less of a chase and more of an unfolding, each step he took in it feeling deliberate, but without the weight of expectation. His sister seemed to feel it too. There was a new serenity in her movements, a calmness in the way she spoke, and the way she would look out at the world with a steady gaze, as if she had learned to appreciate it in a way she hadn't before. The fire that once burned so fiercely within her had mellowed, not in a way that diminished her, but in a way that allowed her to move through the world with less resistance, less friction. She no longer rushed. She no longer fought against the current. She had simply learned to float with it, and it suited her. They had stopped talking so much, but in that silence they understood each other more deeply than words could ever express. It wasn't the absence of communication, but the presence of something more profound. It was in the way they sat together, the way they moved through their days, without needing to fill the spaces with noise. Even the moments of discomfort, the small tensions that arose between them, felt different now, softer, more like ripples on a pond than sharp waves crashing against the shore. The boy's mother, too, seemed to have found something she hadn't realized she was looking for. The weight of her responsibilities, which had once burdened her every step, had lifted, though it wasn't because anything had changed in her life. It was the way she had stopped carrying it all on her own. she had begun to accept the ebb and flow of life, to lean into the support of those around her, to rest in the moments of peace that came without asking for them. There was a softness to her now, a quiet kind of joy that had replaced the exhaustion in her eyes. She had come to understand, just as they had, that everything didn't have to be fixed in order to be whole. One evening, as the sun began to set, and the world was bathed in that soft golden light, the boy found himself outside once again. The sky had deepened into shades of purple and blue, and the air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. He sat on the edge of the porch, his legs dangling, looking out at the familiar world he had come to love. He wasn't waiting for anything. He wasn't searching for meaning. He had stopped doing that long ago. He was simply there, present, in the moment, breathing it all in. His sister joined him, as she often did now, and they sat in silence together, the kind of silence that felt like a conversation all on its own. He could feel the warmth of her presence beside him, the steady rhythm of her breath, and it was enough. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to fill the space with words. In that moment, everything was already understood. "Do you ever think we found it?" she asked quietly, her voice soft against the backdrop of the evening stillness. The boy didn't need to ask what she meant. They both knew. They had both been searching for something, a reason, a purpose,
a meaning, but somewhere along the way they had found something more.
They had found peace in the present, in the quiet unfolding of each day. "I think we have," he said softly, his voice steady, filled with the certainty of something deeply known. "Not because everything is perfect, but because we've stopped
needing it to be." She didn't answer, but he saw the slight curve of her lips, the quiet nod of her head.
It wasn't a question anymore. It was a simple truth they had both come to understand in their own ways. Life didn't need to be figured out. It didn't need to be rushed. It simply needed to be lived, moment by moment, with openness and acceptance. The world around them continued its quiet rhythm. The stars began to appear one by one, and the night stretched out before them like a blanket of endless possibilities. The boy felt a sense of deep gratitude settle into his chest. Not for anything specific, but for everything. For the stillness, for the peace, for the understanding that had woven itself between them all. And in that moment, as the quiet night deepened around them, he realized that the waiting was over. They had arrived, not at the destination, but at the realization that they had always been here, always been enough. The world didn't need to change. They had already changed with it, and that was all they needed. The world continued its slow, patient rhythm, and the boy found himself moving through it without urgency, without the need to rush ahead. Each moment carried its own weight, not in the form of burdens, but in the quiet significance of simply being present. He no longer felt the pressure to make sense of everything, to tie everything together into neat little packages. The world didn't need to be solved. It was enough, just as it was. His sister, too, seemed to be living in this quiet acceptance. She still had her restless moments, but they were fewer now, and when they did arise, they were softer, more like waves brushing against the shore rather than storms tearing through. She had found her own rhythm, not the frantic pace of the past, but something quieter, more deliberate. And in that stillness they both grew closer. Without words, without grand gestures, they had learned to simply be with each other, to be present in ways that felt as natural as breathing. Even his mother had embraced this new flow. The sharpness in her eyes had dulled, replaced by a softness, that came not from age or fatigue, but from the letting go. The weight of her own expectations had lifted, and though life's demands had not changed, she had found a new way to meet them. She no longer carried the world on her shoulders as she once had, and in that release she had found a gentleness in herself she hadn't known was there. One evening, the boy found himself alone again in the garden, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the stars had begun to appear, one by one, like tiny sparks of light against the deep blue canvas of the sky. He had always been drawn to the stars, their quiet, constant presence in the vastness
of the night. They were so far away, yet in their distance they seemed so close, as if they were a part of him, watching over him. He had spent so much of his life waiting for answers, waiting for clarity, waiting for something to change.
But now, as he stood there, staring up at the stars, he realized that he had already found what he was waiting for. He wasn't waiting for anything anymore. He was already part of this vast, unfolding world. The answers he had come to understand were not out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. They were here, in the way the world moved, in the way his family moved, in the way he moved through it all, quietly, without the need to rush ahead. His sister came out to join him then, her footsteps soft on the grass. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him, her presence as familiar as the night itself. Together they looked up at the stars, their silence a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that the waiting had ended for both of them. After a while, she broke the silence. "Do you think we've found it?" she asked, her voice soft, but steady. The boy turned to her, his gaze steady, and for a moment, he didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew what she meant. They had both been searching for something, for peace, for meaning, for a sense of belonging. And now, as they stood together beneath the stars, he realized that the search had never been about finding something. It had always been about learning to be. "I think we've always had it," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had learned, everything they had become. "We just had to stop looking for it." His sister nodded, her eyes reflecting the stars above. She didn't need any more words because they both understood now. The search was over. They had arrived not at some grand destination, but at the understanding that they had always been enough. As they stood there in the cool night, the world around them continued its slow, steady motion. The stars above them shimmered, a constant reminder that everything was as it should be. There was no rush, no need to move forward. They were already here. And for the first time, the boy truly understood what it meant to live in the present, to let go of the need for answers, and to simply be. In the days that followed, the boy found himself more deeply entrenched in the stillness that had become his home. It was as if the world around him had slowed, or perhaps it was he who had finally come to meet it at its own pace. He no longer rushed from one moment to the next, no longer searched for answers that were not his to find. Instead, he simply allowed each day to unfold as it would, each moment breathing life into the next. He didn't have to force it. Life moved through him, and he moved through it with quiet grace. His sister had become more attuned to the rhythm of things too. She still had her moments of restless energy, of course, but there was a softness to her now, a quiet acceptance of herself that had not been there before. She seemed to breathe more easily, no longer carrying the weight of her past struggles like an anchor, dragging her through the present. She had, in her own way, come to terms with who she was, and in that acceptance she had found peace. And then there was his mother. Her presence, once heavy with the weight of expectations and unspoken burdens, had shifted. There were still days when she would retreat into herself, the quiet tension that had always been there, flaring up now and then. But she, too, had found a kind of stillness, a softness in the way she moved through the house, in the way she smiled when she saw them, when she saw him. It was the first time in a long while that he had seen her truly present in her own life. She no longer needed to fix everything. She had learned, as they had, to let things be, to let them unfold naturally. One evening, the boy found himself once again outside, the night air cool against his skin as he sat on the porch, his legs stretched. Out in front of him, the sky was clear, the stars bright and steady, their quiet light filling the vastness of the night. He had always been drawn to the stars, to their constancy, to their quiet presence in the great expanse of the universe. It was a reminder, in a way that no matter how small or insignificant one might feel, they too could shine, could find their place in the world. As he sat there, the world around him still and peaceful, he realized that he had stopped wondering about what came next. He no longer felt the pull to move forward, to search for some elusive meaning. The answers had come not through some great revelation, but through the quiet unfolding of life itself. He had stopped trying to force things into place and had simply allowed them to be. The sound of footsteps behind him broke the stillness, and he turned to find his sister standing at the doorway, her eyes bright in the soft light. She didn't speak at first, just stood there. Her presence a quiet comfort beside him. It had been like this for so long now. An understanding between them, without words, without the need for explanation. She stepped out and sat next to him, her shoulder lightly brushing his, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They sat there in silence, watching the stars together, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. It was the same silence they had shared so many times before, but this time it felt different, deeper, fuller. It was as if they had both come to understand something that had eluded them for so long, that they didn't need to have all the answers. They didn't need to solve everything. Life wasn't something to fix. It was something to live, to breathe through, to experience fully, moment by moment. Finally, his sister spoke, her voice quiet, but her words carrying the weight of everything they had learned together. You know, I think we've both been searching for something, but we've always had it. We've just had to stop looking. The boy nodded, the truth of her words settling into his chest. He didn't need to search anymore. He didn't need to look for something that wasn't already there. Life had already given him everything he needed. It wasn't about waiting for something to change or for a grand revelation to come. It was about being present, about embracing the moments as they came without trying to rush them, without trying to control them. "I think you're right," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the stars above. It was always here. They sat there together in the quiet of the night, no longer waiting, no longer searching. The stars continued to shine, steady and bright, and the boy felt, for the first time, that he had found his place in it all. He wasn't searching for meaning anymore. He had already found it, not in the grand gestures of life, but in the small, quiet moments that made up the fabric of his days. And in that understanding he found peace. The quiet rhythm of their days continued without interruption, like the steady flow of a river that knew its course. The boy no longer felt the weight of expectation pressing on him, nor did he feel the pull of something missing. He had become part of the world around him, a small but significant piece of the vast unfolding tapestry. Each moment was simply what it was, no more, no less. And he found peace in that simplicity. He spent more time with his sister, their shared silences now something they could both cherish. They didn't need to talk about everything. The bond they shared had grown stronger, more subtle. It was in the way they moved through their days together, how they both respected the quiet space between them, and how they never forced the other to speak before they were ready. There was a comfort in that, in knowing that words weren't always necessary to communicate everything they needed. His mother had found her own rhythm too. The weight she had carried for so long had softened, though it was clear that life still held its demands. She had learned, just as he had, to breathe through them, to let the tension slide away without clinging to it. He could see it in the way she moved around the house, no longer burdened by the frantic pace that had once dictated her every action. She had stopped trying to be everything for everyone, and, in doing so, had found a new strength, one that was quieter but more enduring. Even the house itself had settled into a peaceful state, the quiet hum of daily life weaving through the walls. There was a gentleness to it now, as if the space between moments had stretched, allowing for breathing room where there had once been none. It was the same house, but it felt different, lighter somehow, as if it too had let go of something it had been holding on to for far too long. One evening, after a long day of simple tasks, the boy found himself outside again, this time near the edge of the yard where the trees grew thick. The sky had darkened into a deep, velvet blue, and the stars were scattered across it like 1,000 tiny, steady lights. He wasn't sure why he had come out here, but he felt a pull toward the quiet space. As he stood there, looking up, he felt the familiar stillness fill him once again, the weight of the world settling into something lighter, more comfortable. He heard footsteps behind him, and without turning around, he knew it was his sister. She had a way of moving that always felt like a quiet invitation, and he didn't need to see her to know she was there. She stepped up beside him, standing a little closer than she had before, but still giving him the space he needed. They stood, in silence, their gazes lifted to the sky, both of them taking in the same stars, the same quiet beauty. "I think we're okay now," she said, her voice breaking the stillness, but in a way that felt almost like the natural continuation of everything they had shared. The boy turned to look at her, his gaze steady. He didn't need to say anything because he knew she was right. They had reached a place where they no longer needed to search, no longer needed to wait. They had found peace in the quiet, in the spaces between their words, and in the way their lives had unfolded without the need for grand moments or sweeping changes. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was enough. "I think we've always been okay," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of their shared understanding. She smiled at that, the first real smile he had seen on her face in a long time, and in that smile he saw everything they had been through, everything they had learned together. It wasn't about the answers or the destination, it was about the journey, about the quiet moments, about the way they had learned to be with each other and with themselves. The night stretched on, the stars shining brightly above them, and for the first time the boy felt no need to look ahead. He wasn't waiting for something more. He had found it all, right here, right now, in the stillness and the simplicity of the world around him. And that in itself was enough. The days continued to unfold in their quiet, steady rhythm, each one folding gently into the next. The boy had learned to live in the ebb and flow of life, no longer caught in the urgency of moments that rushed past him. He had become a part of the world around him, moving through it with a sense of belonging, a quiet understanding that everything was as it should be. There were still moments of doubt, of course, but they came less frequently, and when they did arrive, they no longer had the power to unsettle him. He had stopped searching for answers because, in a way, he had already found them. His sister, too, seemed to have settled into her own rhythm. The restlessness that had once defined her movements was now tempered by a quiet peace. She still had her bursts of energy, her moments of impatience, but they no longer controlled her. She had learned to sit with the stillness, to breathe through the spaces between moments. There was no rush, no need to push forward. She was enough, just as she was, and that realization had brought a kind of calmness to her, something that had always eluded her before. His mother, too, seemed lighter. The weight that had once settled so heavily on her shoulders had shifted, softened. She no longer carried the world with the same heaviness, and though life's demands still called to her, she had learned to answer them with grace. The boy noticed the small things, how her laugh had become more frequent, how the corners of her eyes crinkled when she smiled, how her presence no longer filled the house with tension, but with a quiet warmth. She had, in her own way, come to understand the peace he had found, and in doing so, she had found her own. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the yard, the boy sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the sky. The air was cool, the scent of earth and leaves heavy in the evening stillness. He had been here so many times before, but tonight it felt different. He was no longer waiting for something to change. There was no more longing, no more searching for something outside of himself to bring fulfillment. It had all been here, inside him, all along. His sister joined him, as she often did, her presence a quiet comfort. She didn't sit immediately beside him, but stood for a moment, looking out at the fading light. It was as though she needed to feel the world around her, to sink into the moment before taking her place beside him. She sat down, her legs crossed, and they both settled into the silence, no words necessary. The rhythm of the evening, the soft hum of the world around them, filled the space between them, a shared understanding that neither of them needed to put into words. After a long while, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we've reached it?" The boy didn't need to ask what she meant. He had been thinking the same thing. It wasn't the end, of course, but it felt like a culmination, not of a journey, but of an understanding, a quiet arrival at the place they had been seeking all
along. He turned to her, his gaze steady, and nodded. "I think we've always been here," he said softly. "We just didn't know it." The weight of the words hung between them, not heavy but meaningful in the quiet way that truth settles in.
There was no more need to search, no more waiting for something to happen. Everything they had needed was here, in this moment, in the space they had created together. They had arrived not at some destination, but at the realization that everything was enough. The stars began to appear, one by one, like quiet sentinels watching over the world. The night stretched on, deep and silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full in a way that words couldn't capture. There was a peace that settled, in the space between them, a comfort that was simply knowing that they didn't have to search anymore. They had found it together, in the quiet of the night. And as the night deepened, the boy closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze brush against his skin, the soft sounds of the world around him filling his ears. He wasn't waiting for anything, not anymore. He was simply here, exactly where he needed to be. The following days were quiet, but not without purpose. The boy noticed how the passing of time no longer felt like something to be endured, but something to be appreciated. The world around him, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of the river, the soft calls of birds as they settled for the night, had become a constant, gentle reminder that there was no rush, no need to race ahead. He moved through, each day with a stillness that felt more like belonging than waiting. The need for answers, for clarity, had faded into something less pressing, something more fluid, like the ebb and flow of the tide. His sister, though still carrying the quiet, restlessness that had always defined her, seemed to have found something new. Her energy was different now, less frantic, more focused. She spent hours in the garden, her hands working the soil, with an intensity that reflected not just the act of nurturing life, but the way she was learning to nurture herself. The boy watched her in those moments, noticing the way she moved with intention, the way she seemed to have finally come to terms with the world around her. It was a quiet kind of strength, one that didn't shout for attention, but was steady, like the earth itself. His mother, too, had shifted in subtle ways. She still had her moments of weariness, the weight of life's demands pressing against her like it did for everyone. But there was a calmness in her now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. The boy saw it in the way she spoke to him, in the way she moved around the house, in the way she simply existed in the world without feeling the need to control everything. She had stopped fighting so hard against the current, and in that surrender, she had found peace. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows began to stretch across the yard, the boy found himself outside again. He stood at the edge of the garden, the cool breeze brushing against his skin, and looked out at the horizon. The world around him was still, the air heavy with the scent of earth and growing things. It was in these moments, in the quiet spaces, that he felt most connected to the world. Not because anything had changed, but because he had learned to see it all for what it was, simple, yet full of meaning. He heard footsteps behind him, and when he turned, he saw his sister approaching. She didn't speak at first, but there was something in the way she walked toward him. Something soft, something different. She came to stand beside him, and together they gazed out at the fading light, the evening settling in around them. It wasn't uncomfortable, the silence between them. It was comfortable in a way that felt almost like coming home. After a long while, she broke the silence, her voice quiet but sure. "Do you think we're really here? Like, here in the way we've always needed to be?" The boy thought about her question for a moment, the weight of it settling in the spaces between them. He hadn't expected her to ask it, but now that she had, it felt like the question had always been there, just waiting for the right moment. He turned to her, his gaze steady, and smiled softly. "I think we've always been here," he said, the truth of it clear in his voice. "We just had to stop looking for it." She didn't respond right away, but he could see the understanding in her eyes, the quiet recognition of the journey they had both been on. They had spent so much of their lives searching for something outside of themselves, waiting for life to give them the answers. But now, in this stillness, they both understood that the answers had always been inside them. They had been living them all along. The stars had begun to appear now, scattered across the sky like quiet promises, and the boy felt the familiar sense of peace settle in his chest. There was no more searching, no more waiting. Everything had come full circle, and in that understanding, he found a deep kind of contentment. The world didn't need to be fixed. It simply needed to be lived, moment by moment, with an open heart and an open mind. He stood there with his sister, watching the night unfold around them, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to look ahead. There was no rush, no hurry. Life was exactly as it should be, and for the first time he understood that this quiet, this peace, was enough. The quiet had become an old friend, a constant presence that filled the spaces between moments. The boy no longer felt the need to question it, to wonder if something more was just beyond the horizon. He had learned to live in the stillness, to embrace it without seeking anything further. It was no longer a feeling of waiting for something to happen, but a deep acceptance of everything that was already here. The garden, the trees, the birds that flew overhead, the soft rustle of the leaves in the wind, they had always been a
part of him, and he had finally realized that they were enough.
Life continued on, but it no longer felt as if it were rushing toward an end. Time was no longer a river to be crossed, but a journey to be experienced moment by moment. The days stretched out before him like an endless expanse of peacefulness, filled with quiet and calm. There was no need for grand moments or dramatic changes. The simple act of being present was enough, and that realization had settled in like the softest blanket, wrapping itself around him. His sister, too, had settled into a rhythm of her own. She no longer wore the heavy burden of restlessness that had once defined her. There were no more frantic movements, no more searching for something she couldn't name. She had learned to breathe through her days, to appreciate the moments without the need for them to be anything more. The weight she had carried for so long had lifted, and in its place there was a quiet strength, a stillness that came from understanding that she didn't need to change the world around her. She only needed to be a part of it. The boy found himself watching her more often now, noticing how she moved through the world with a new kind of ease. She still had her moments, her bursts of energy that made her restless, but they were different now. They didn't control her, didn't overwhelm
her.
Instead, they were a part of the quiet dance she moved through every day, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, there was always room for something more. His mother, too, had found a kind of peace. It was subtle, this change in her. She no longer carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, and the boy could see the lightness in her movements, in the way she spoke, in the way she smiled. There was no rush in her steps anymore, no need to push through the demands of life as if they were obstacles. She had learned, as they all had, to simply exist in the world, to allow things to unfold at their own pace. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the boy found himself walking through the garden, his fingers brushing against the leaves of the plants. He wasn't looking for anything, wasn't seeking some moment of clarity or revelation. He was simply walking, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling the earth beneath his feet. There was no urgency in his movements. He was just there, in the moment, grounded in the quiet, surrounded by the life that had always been there. His sister joined him after a while, walking quietly by his side, neither of them needing to speak. There was a comfort in the silence between them now, a shared understanding that didn't require explanation. They had both found peace in the stillness, and together they walked through the garden, letting the evening unfold around them. It was enough to simply be there, side by side, breathing in the air, feeling the earth beneath their feet, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky above. And in that moment, the boy understood something deeper. The world didn't need to be fixed or solved. It didn't need to be understood. It simply needed to be lived, to be experienced with open eyes and an open heart. The answers would come, not in the grand moments, but in the quiet, everyday acts of living. And for the first time, he realized that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not in the future, not in some far-off dream, but right here, right now, in this quiet moment. And that, in itself, was enough. The days drifted forward, their rhythm gentle, unhurried, like the turn of a page in a well-worn book. The boy found comfort in the familiarity of it all, in the quiet unfolding of time that no longer seemed to demand anything of him. He no longer searched for meaning in every moment, no longer questioned the passing of time. It was enough, just to be. Every moment, simple as it was, carried its own weight, a weight not of obligation, but of presence. His sister continued to find solace in the small things, tending to the garden, the steady rhythm of life that moved through her with
quiet grace. She no longer sought to fill the space with words or actions.
Instead, she learned to sit with the stillness, to feel the world around her without needing to change it. There was a peace about her now, something that had settled in her bones, something that had come not from the absence of struggle, but from the acceptance of it. His mother, too, had found a new place within herself. She no longer felt the need to bear the weight of the world alone. There was still a quiet strength in her, but now it was accompanied by a gentleness that had been
missing for so long.
She laughed more often, smiled more easily, and the weight of her responsibilities no longer seemed so heavy. The boy had watched her change, had watched her let go of the need to control everything, and in that release he had seen her become more fully herself. One evening, after dinner, the boy found himself sitting alone on the porch. The sun had set, and the stars were beginning to fill the sky. The air was cool, the first hint of autumn in the breeze. He hadn't planned to be outside, but something about the evening called to him. He sat there in the quiet, letting the stillness settle over him. The world felt alive in a way he had never truly noticed before. Not loud or overwhelming, but alive in the way the earth itself was alive, steadily, quietly, unhurried. His sister came out to join him, her presence
a familiar comfort.
She sat beside him without saying a word, both of them looking out at the stars in the silence. There was no need for conversation between them. They had long since learned that sometimes silence could speak louder than any words could. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft in the cool night air. "Do you think we're finally where we need to be?" The boy looked at her, the question lingering between them like a breath held in the air. He thought about it for a moment, but the answer felt simple, clear. "I think we've always been here," he said quietly, the words settling deep inside him as they passed his lips. "We just needed to stop looking for it." She didn't say anything in response, but he could see the understanding in her eyes. They had both come so far, and in that quiet, in that shared silence, they both knew that they had arrived. Not at some grand destination, but at the simple truth that they had always been enough. The night stretched on, the stars shining brightly above them, the world around them continuing its slow, steady rhythm. The boy realized that there was nothing more to chase, no need to rush forward. The moment they were living in was enough. And in that realization, he felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. He didn't need to search for anything outside himself. He had already found it, and for the first time, in the stillness of the night, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not because he had figured everything out, but because he had learned to simply be. And that was enough. As the seasons continued their quiet march, the boy found that the world around him was changing, but in ways that felt gentle, almost imperceptible. The air was cooler now, the leaves on the trees shifting from vibrant green to shades of gold and crimson. He could sense the passage of time, not as something to be hurried through, but as something to be embraced. It wasn't the rush of events or the push for progress that shaped his days anymore. It was the space between them, the quiet moments, the pauses, the in-betweens, that now held the most meaning. He woke up in the mornings with a sense of clarity that had come slowly, quietly. He no longer felt the need to map out the day, to plan every step. He had learned to let things unfold, to let time stretch out before him without the burden of expectation. Each morning the light would spill into his room, and he would take a slow breath, feeling the world awake around him. There was peace in the stillness of it, peace in the knowing that he didn't have to chase after anything. Life continued on, but it no longer felt as if it were rushing toward an end. Time was no longer a river to be crossed, but a journey to be experienced, moment by moment. The days stretched out before him like an endless expanse of peacefulness, filled with quiet and calm. There was no need for grand moments or dramatic changes. The simple act of being present was enough, and that realization had settled in like the softest blanket, wrapping itself around him. His sister, too, had settled into a rhythm of her own. She no longer wore the heavy burden of restlessness that had once defined her. There were no more frantic movements, no more searching for something she couldn't name. She had learned to breathe through her days, to appreciate the moments without the need for them to be anything more. The weight she had carried for so long had lifted, and in its place there was a quiet strength, a stillness that came from understanding that she didn't need to change the world around her. She only needed to be a part of it. The boy found himself watching her more often now, noticing how she moved through the world with a new kind of ease. She still had her moments, her bursts of energy that made her restless, but they were different now. They didn't control her, didn't overwhelm her. Instead, they were a part of the quiet dance she moved through every day, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, there was always room for something more. His mother, too, had found a kind of peace. It was subtle, this change in her. She no longer carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, and the boy could see the lightness in her movements, in the way she spoke, in the way she smiled. There was no rush in her steps anymore, no need to push through the demands of life as if they were obstacles. She had learned, as they all had, to simply exist in the world, to allow things to unfold at their own pace. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the boy found himself walking through the garden, his fingers brushing against the leaves of the plants. He wasn't looking for anything, wasn't seeking some moment of clarity or revelation. He was simply walking, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling the earth beneath his feet. There was no urgency in his movements. He was just there, in the moment, grounded in the quiet, surrounded by the life that had always been there. His sister joined him after a while, walking quietly by his side, neither of them needing to speak. There was a comfort in the silence between them now, a shared understanding that didn't require explanation. They had both found peace in the stillness, and together they walked through the garden, letting the evening unfold around them. It was enough to simply be there, side by side, breathing in the air, feeling the earth beneath their feet, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky above. And in that moment, the boy understood something deeper. The world didn't need to be fixed or solved. It didn't need to be understood. It simply needed to be lived, to be experienced with open eyes and an open heart. The answers would come, not in the grand moments, but in the quiet, everyday acts of living. And for the first time, he realized that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not in the future, not in some far-off dream, but right here, right now, in this quiet moment. And that, in itself, was enough. The days drifted forward, their rhythm gentle, unhurried, like the turn of a page in a well-worn book. The boy found comfort in the familiarity of it all, in the quiet unfolding of time that no longer seemed to demand anything of him. He no longer searched for meaning in every moment, no longer questioned the passing of time. It was enough, just to be. Every moment, simple as it was, carried its own weight. A weight not of obligation, but of presence. His sister continued to find solace in the small things, tending to the garden, the steady rhythm of life that moved through her with quiet grace. She no longer sought to fill the space with words or actions. Instead, she learned to sit with the stillness, to feel the world around her without needing to change it. There was a peace about her now, something that had settled in her bones, something that had come not from the absence of struggle, but from the acceptance of it. His mother, too, had found a new place within herself. She no longer felt the need to bear the weight of the world alone. There was still a quiet strength in her, but now it was accompanied by a gentleness that had been missing for so long. She laughed more often, smiled more easily, and the weight of her responsibilities no longer seemed so heavy. The boy had watched her change, had watched her let go of the need to control everything, and in that release he had seen her become more fully herself. One evening after dinner, the boy found himself sitting alone on the porch. The sun had set, and the stars were beginning to fill the sky. The air was cool, the first hint of autumn in the breeze. He hadn't planned to be outside, but something about the evening called to him. He sat there in the quiet, letting the stillness settle over him. The world felt alive in a way he had never truly noticed before. Not loud or overwhelming, but alive in the way the earth itself was alive, steadily, quietly, unhurried. His sister came out to join him, her presence, a familiar comfort. She sat beside him without saying a word, both of them looking out at the stars in the silence. There was no need for conversation between them. They had long since learned that sometimes silence could speak louder than any words could. After a while, she spoke, her voice soft in the cool night air. "Do you think we're finally where we need to be?" The boy looked at her, the question lingering between them like a breath held in the air. He thought about it for a moment, but the answer felt simple, clear. "I think we've always been here," he said quietly, the words settling deep inside him as they passed his lips. "We just needed to stop looking for it." She didn't say anything in response, but he could see the understanding in her eyes. They had both come so far, and in that quiet, in that shared silence, they both knew that they had arrived, not at some grand destination, but at the simple truth that they had always been enough. The night stretched on, the stars shining brightly above them, the world around them continuing its slow, steady rhythm. The boy realized that there was nothing more to chase, no need to rush forward. The moment they were living in was enough. And in that realization, he felt a deep sense of peace settle within him. He didn't need to search for anything outside himself. He had already found it, and for the first time, in the stillness of the night, he knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not because he had figured everything out, but because he had learned to simply be. And that was enough. As the seasons continued their quiet march, the boy found that the world around him was changing, but in ways that felt gentle, almost imperceptible. The air was cooler now, the leaves on the trees shifting from vibrant green to shades of gold and crimson. He could sense the passage of time, not as something to be hurried through, but as something to be embraced. It wasn't the rush of events or the push for progress that shaped his days anymore. It was the space between them, the quiet moments, the pauses, the in-betweens, that now held the most meaning. He woke up in the mornings with a sense of clarity that had come slowly, quietly. He no longer felt the need to map out the day, to plan every step. He had learned to let things unfold, to let time stretch out before him without the burden of expectation. Each morning, the light would spill into his room, and he would take a slow breath, feeling the world awake around him. There was peace in the stillness of it, peace in the knowing that he didn't have to chase after anything.